Thank you very much for that very kind and overly generous introduction, Mr. Vargas. I'm delighted to be invited to Estoril for this conference. I'm particularly happy to be in Portugal. For anybody that cares a lot about the fate of democracy, Portugal in the 20th century played an extremely important role because Portugal was really the country that led what Samuel Huntington labeled the third wave of democratization. After the Salazar dictatorship, there was a transition that could have gone the wrong way in this country. And it was, I think, largely the result of the efforts of the Portuguese people, but also, I think, their friends in the broader world of Europe and beyond that made sure that the transition was to a liberal democracy in which people could interact and participate in a free political community. And so this was a historic achievement. It stood at the beginning of a momentous wave of democratization that we are still, whose effects we are still seeing today. So thank you for inviting me. I'm going to speak a little bit differently than what might be suggested by the title of my talk, because I'm going to begin with the Middle East and my view of that. I'm not the expert. Mr. Albarrade is here, and he's going to speak to you later in this conference. And all of the truth about what's happening in the Middle East is really for him to discuss. But I also want to talk about models of politics and governance as we go forward, including the one that's offered by China. And I want to talk a little bit about democracy in the United States and Portugal and other parts of the developed world, because I don't think that we can take democracy for granted in our present-day world, and we need to defend those institutions, but also figure out how to make them work better. So let me begin with the Middle East and my view of the meaning of the Arab Spring. I think you have to see this against the background of this, what I labeled the third wave of democratization. So beginning with Spain and Portugal, Greece and Turkey in the 1970s, continuing through Latin America in the 1980s, in a sense culminating with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then on to Africa, Asia, other parts of the world. We went from about 40 electoral democracies in the world to about 110 or 120 by the early 2000s. The only part of the world that did not participate in this general move towards democracy was the Arab Middle East. In fact, there were many Muslim countries like Indonesia and Turkey that had successful democracies, but this wave didn't touch the Arab world. And in the West, there was a common line of interpretation that said that for one reason or another, the Arabs could not democratize, that there was an Arab exception to this general rule, whether it was based on Islam or based on something about Arab culture. And I think that one of the important first lessons that we can draw from the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and now Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, and other places is that the Arabs are no different from anybody else in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Africa. There's nothing wrong with them. They do not want to live under a dictatorship any more than anyone else does. Mohamed Bouazizi, the Tunisian vegetable seller who triggered this uprising, had his vegetable cart taken away by the police on several occasions. He tried to complain. The police wouldn't listen. He was slapped by a policewoman. He was insulted. And that's the point at which he set himself on fire. And I think that this experience of having your dignity not respected by an authoritarian government is, first of all, a universal experience among people that live in such regimes, but it also reflects a universal desire to have one's dignity recognized. And in a democracy that grants people the rights of citizenship, including the right to vote, the right to speak freely, that dignity is recognized in a way that it is not in an authoritarian regime. And so in this respect, I think the Arab Spring demonstrates this universal desire for recognition that is at the basis of all of the mobilization in favor of democracy. And the Arab peoples in one country after another have shown that they can mobilize, they can defend their interests, they can protest, they can speak up. There's not a passive culture that prevents them from doing this. And in fact, I think that if you look at the reasons why the Arab world has come late to this broader party, it doesn't have anything to do with deep cultural reasons. It has much more to do with short-term factors. One of them, unfortunately, I think, is American foreign policy, because for many years, the dictators in this region used the excuse of radical Islamism as a reason for their authoritarian rule and for clamping down on their own populations. And I think that too often Washington, being fearful of this Islamist upsurge, bought these arguments at their face and continued to support them in spite of the fact that they were not regarded as legitimate. Oil is another factor, both in helping authoritarian regimes buy their way out of trouble, but also as a source of funding for Wahhabi or Salafist forms of Islam that are particularly intolerant. And then finally, I think the continuation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has given everybody in the region an excuse to be distracted by that particular issue that to this day has not been solved, and therefore to take their attention away from abuses at home. So I think the reasons that we didn't see this materializing earlier really had a lot to do with politics and foreign policy and nothing about the region itself. Now, in thinking about what's gone on here, I actually think that my old mentor, Samuel Huntington, was actually the best source of reference to understand these revolutions. This is not the Samuel Huntington of The Clash of Civilizations. That book I actually disagreed with quite a lot. This actually is the Samuel Huntington who in 1968 wrote a very important book called Political Order in Changing Societies. In that book, he said that revolutions are never caused by the poorest of the poor. They are almost always caused by middle-class, educated people whose rising expectations are not met by regimes that do not permit them to participate in the life of the country and whose economic systems are closed and do not offer them opportunities for advancement. And it seems to me that very much this was the situation in both Tunisia and Egypt. If you look at the human development scores of both of these countries over the past 20 years, they're not stellar performers, but they're also not laggards either. They both increased 25, 30% over this period in terms of education, health, and the like. And both of them have actually sent quite a lot of young people to college for higher education. And it is that group of people, it seems to me, that was at the core of both of those revolutions, meaning that, in some sense, the destabilization was caused by the very process of modernization. And that is the same process we saw unfold all the way back in the French Revolution and in many earlier upheavals earlier in the century. The role of religion that many people had feared, I think, was actually quite minor. So this week, everybody has been talking about Osama bin Laden. I'm happy that they finally got him as an American, but in the end, I don't think it's very meaningful because I don't think that Al-Qaeda ultimately is going to go down in history as a very meaningful organization. It never represented the mainstream of political life anywhere in the Middle East. It was always a fringe group that succeeded in gaining attention for itself and could build off of the frustrations and grievances of people in that area. But already, before the death of Osama bin Laden, it had been marginalized by large numbers of young people in the region who wanted to join the rest of the world. They wanted to enjoy what Asians and people in Latin America and in Europe were already enjoying in terms of connection with the modern world. And that particular brand of terrorism was not going to lead them to that point. And I think that it's interesting as these revolutions develop, what the evolving role of religion will be. There's no question that there's a danger that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt today and its equivalent in other Arab countries oftentimes may not be a majority opinion, but it represents one of the best organized political forces. And so I don't want to underplay the danger that a certain strand of Islamism represents in that part of the world. But it does seem to me that that is not the dominant story that is going on in that part of the world. We, in fact, have two different Islamist models in front of us, that of Iran and that of Turkey. And if I were a contemporary Islamist today looking at Iran that is under sanction, that is economically stagnant, that has no internal freedom, that is obviously regarded as illegitimate by probably a majority of its population, versus Turkey, that is growing, dynamic, still aspires to enter Europe, is a leader in the region, which would you pick? I think, as we Americans say, that is a no-brainer. So the nature of religion and the role it's played has changed. Now, what does this tell us about development and modernization more generally? What it tells me is that politics is very important. All of the different components of development, economic growth and change in political systems and the shift in societies as people get better educated, move to cities, change their occupations, and do all of the things that involve living in the modern world, are all separate phenomena in a certain way. And if you neglect the political part of modernization, you are asking for trouble, because part of what people want in a modern society is not just consumer goods, a high standard of living, security. They also want to be treated with dignity. They want that political participation. And therefore, a political order that tries to base itself simply on a narrow base of power without taking into account the fact that now people are educated, they're on Facebook and Twitter, they talk to each other, they see examples from around the world. If you try to, in some sense, deny the power of that social mobilization, you are not going to survive. So even if, in the short run, we have setbacks in this democratic uprising, in the short run, I don't believe that the power of this movement is going to ultimately be stoppable, and that includes a country like Iran, where in a sense it began in the last few years. Now, having said that, and having said that I'm generally optimistic about the developments in this region, because the first step has now been taken, I have to now say that there are going to be major, major challenges in every country in the Middle East. And in fact, I think this is something Americans tend to be particularly guilty of. We oftentimes emphasize the initial transition to democracy at the expense of the consolidation and the slow building of democratic institutions that needs to follow onto this. And indeed, I have followed up the end of history with a book that I just published that just appeared in the United States, called The Origins of Political Order, in which I really argue that institutions, and particularly the ones that support a modern democratic order, are incredibly difficult to come by, that they represent a long historical process and you cannot take them for granted. There are really three of them that are important. You have to have a state. You have to have a government that can exercise power and use power to enforce laws. That's actually one of the great weaknesses in many developing countries, that they became political entities with a nominal government, but they actually did not have the power to make laws stick. The second important set of institutions is the rule of law, which is a limitation of the power of government. that says that governments must live under common rules of justice that are higher than the will of the current executive. This is an old tradition in the West. In fact, in Western development, the development of Europe started with the rule of law before you had the rise of the modern state, and the particular balance of state and rule of law is conditioned by that particular sequence, which really has not occurred in other parts of the world. The final set of institutions are institutions of accountability, which today we understand to be democratic multi-party elections, by which populations can discipline their rulers, get rid of bad ones, put to the front ones that people prefer. The big problem, I think, in the consolidation of democracy is that of these three baskets of institutions, the easiest by far to put in place are the multi-party elections, and that tends to be the ones that we go to first. At the moment, there is an international network of supportive institutions that will oversee internationally free and fair elections for whatever country wants to hold them. And so getting to an election, as we've seen in Afghanistan or Iraq, is actually not that difficult. The much bigger problems are in the first sets of institutions. To have a government that can use power without corruption, that can use it competently, that can actually deliver services like education and healthcare, basic security. This is something that eludes the majority of countries in the developing world. And secondly, the rule of law. That is to say, these constraints on the power of the powerful that make them live within clear and transparent rules. And so, for example, we were all extremely optimistic at the time of the Orange Revolution or the Rose Revolution in Ukraine and Georgia back in 2004. As a result of the democratic Ukrainian governments, the Orange Coalition's inability to deliver good government because they could not form a stable coalition, because they were still engaged in corruption, because there is a huge amount of internal squabbling. The very president that stole that election in 2004 is back in power in the Ukraine. And I think that it is not just likely, but almost inevitable that in the Middle East, the hopes of these early days is going to be disappointed. I think we need to get ready for that. Whether this happens in 6 months or a year or even 5 years down the road, the hopes of the Arab Spring are simply not going to be met in terms of the creation in a short period of time of durable democratic institutions. This is not a comment on anybody or any of the Democrats in the region. It is testimony to the difficulty of putting together institutions, particularly in societies where you come out from under the shadow of authoritarian government, where there's no free press, there's no political parties, there's no civil society. All of the components that you need for a successful mobilization of a democratic public have not been permitted, and to put these in place in any short period of time is going to be very difficult.